Da ønsker jeg deg velkommen til en ny episode i Spanskpodden. I dagens episode skal jeg avsløre en hemmelighet. Jeg kaller det en hemmelighet fordi det er ikke så mange som vet om dette fenomenet. Og det er det flere grunner til. Det første vi må spørre om, hvem er dette sin hemmelighet? Eller hvem sitter på denne informasjonen? Og for det andre så kan vi spørre, hvem har bruk for denne informasjonen? Hemmeligheten er altså en metode som man kan bruke for å bli god i et nytt språk. Undersøkelser viser at dette er den beste metoden du kan bruke for å bli god i et nytt fremmedspråk. I de undersøkelsene man har foretatt med deltakere som har blitt gode i for eksempel spansk med denne metoden, har de et langt høyere prestasjonsnivå etter endt undervisning enn studenter som har gått kurs som har vært lagt opp etter en tradisjonell metode basert på vokabulartrening og grilling av grammatikk. Denne metoden er altså nyttig for både den som lager kurs i fremmedspråket, men den er like nyttig og viktig for deg som holder på å lære språk eller har lyst til å begynne å lære språk. Derfor bestemte jeg meg for å lage en episode i Spanskpodden der jeg tar for meg metoden, og så har jeg intervjuet en lærer som har brukt denne metoden i sin undervisning, og også skrevet litteratur som man kan lese, som er tilpasset nivået til språkstudenten. Metoden jeg snakker om er altså metoden til Stephen Krashen, som kalles The Input Hypothesis. Hvis du har lyst til å lese mer om denne metoden, så kan du begynne med å søke på Wikipedia. Det finnes også mange andre som snakker om og tar for seg denne metoden, og hvordan den er laget og hvordan den er bygget opp. Man bruker altså comprehensible input, eller forståelig språkinnhold, som kilde til språktilegnelsen. Og legg merke til at jeg bruker tilegnelse og ikke læring, fordi det er det handler om. Altså vi snakker om at vi tilegner oss et språk, men vi lærer om et språk hvis vi bedriver språklæring. Forskjellen mellom språklæring og språktilegnelse blir også forklart godt i intervjuet som du skal få høre i fortsettelsen av denne episoden. CI, eller Comprehensible Input, eller forståelig språkinnhold, er en metode for å tilegne seg fremmedspråk. Vi snakker om en metode som bruker språklig informasjon, altså språkinnhold, som kilde til å tilegne seg språk. Metoden er den samme som små barn blir utsatt for når de skal tilegne seg sitt morsmål. Vi kan si at det er både likheter og forskjeller med det som skjer med små barn. Likhetene er at både språkstudenter og små barn trenger store mengder språk for å tilegne seg et nytt språk. Altså, alle trenger masse input. Forskjellen ser vi når vi vet at små barn også skal lære metodikken med det å snakke. Den har vi som er voksne allerede utviklet, og derfor vil vi ikke trenge ekstra tid for å få til lydene. Likevel kan vi si at lydtrening er en viktig del av fremmedspråklæringen, fordi nye språk har nye og uvante lyder som vi trenger tid til å trene inn. Derfor er det også viktig at du øver på å snakke eller uttale ord og lyder høyt for deg selv, slik at munnen blir vant til å formulere ordene på riktig måte. Og da er det viktig at du har noe å lytte til som kan hjelpe deg til å finne en riktig måte å uttale ordene på, som er at du hermer det du allerede hører. Og jo mer du hører med den riktige uttalen av språket, jo flinkere blir du til å kunne gjenta eller herme det du hører på en sånn måte at du blir forstått godt når du snakker fremmedspråket. Likevel er ikke behovet for tid så stort for oss voksne som for barn i 1 til 2 års alder. En annen likhet er at vi ikke trenger en masse grammatikk for å bli gode i et fremmedspråk. Det vi trenger er å forstå det vi hører. Derfor det viktig at den som bruker denne metoden for å lære selv eller for å undervise, spesielt bevisst på hvordan språkinnholdet man bruker som kilde i tilegnelsesprosessen satt sammen eller ser ut. Sammensetningen altså at i et språkinnhold som du skal høre på, så det viktig at 90% av det innholdet du skal høre, inneholder språk som du kjenner fra før. Altså du kan 90% av det som blir sagt fra før. Og så det da sånn at 10% av det språkinnholdet du forholder deg til, det kan inneholde ukjent språk. Forutsetningen skal alltid være at språkinnholdet forståelig og gjenkjennelig, og at det som nytt språk kan bli forstått ut fra sammenhengen. Det det beskrivelsen av Comprehensible Input og teorien til Stephen Krashen handler om. Så når vi snakker om teorien Comprehensible Input, så snakker vi altså om den måten å sette sammen nytt og gammelt språkinnhold på, som gjør at vi forstår det nye ut fra den informasjonen vi allerede forstår resten av språkinnholdet vi sitter og lytter til. Så både den som underviser og studenten har altså bruk for denne teorien. Hvis du ønsker å lære mer spansk, så kan du gå til leonlingua.no/kurs. Der finner du link til påmelding til gratiskurs, og også påmelding til betalingskurs. Lykke til! Som student det viktig, for den hjelper deg som ønsker å bli god i et språk, til å bli nettopp det, å bli god i språk. Da det viktig at du som student vet hvor du kan finne materiell til Comprehensible Input, eller forståelig språkinnhold. Jeg har laget et lite minikurs i spansk, der du får en oversikt eller en oppskrift på hvor du kan finne godt Comprehensible Input. Og link til dette gratiskurset finner du i beskrivelsen i podcastepisodene i Spanskpodden. Jeg som spansklærer har også bruk for denne teorien fordi når jeg lager spanskkurs, må tilpasse min måte å bruke spansk på som gjør mitt språk forståelig for den som skal bli god i spansk. Derfor alle mine spanskkurs laget etter denne metoden. Alle nivåene bygget opp etter Comprehensible Input, eller forståelig språkinnhold, og 90-10% innpasset i alt det jeg har laget og vil lage i fremtiden. Så kommer vi til poenget i dag. Hvordan kan jeg bli god i spansk med å lese bøker? Dette spørsmålet skal du få svar på i fortsettelsen av episoden. Vi ser altså på bøkene som en måte å finne comprehensible input eller forståelig språkinnhold på, og da det viktig at man har mulighet til å finne bøker som laget nettopp med hensyn til den som sitter på andre siden og skal lytte til eller høre på eller lese språkinnholdet i bøker. Og nå snakker jeg altså ikke om klassiske type lærebøker, sånn som vi kan kjenne på eller huske at vi var utsatt for i skolesammenheng. Men jeg snakker om litterære bøker, altså bøker som handler om litteratur, eller som har et kulturelt innhold, samtidig som det laget med tanke på de som ikke veldig gode i språk, og som trenger et tilrettelagt språknivå som gjør at de forstår det de leser. Jeg har snakket med en av de mest erfarne spansklærerne som har brukt denne metoden siden den ble anerkjent, og hennes erfaringer spennende å lytte til. Intervjuet foregår på engelsk og ikke på spansk. Hun heter Adriana Ramirez og fremmedspråklærer i både spansk og engelsk, og forfatter av en mengde bøker som hun har skrevet for å kunne bruke i spanskundervisningen. Adriana fra Colombia, og alt hun har skrevet har 2 innfallsvinkler, nemlig det språklige og det kulturelle. Vi hører hvordan hun bruker bøkene sine i undervisningen, og hvorfor det er så viktig å lese bøker som er fengende og interessante. Dette siste er nemlig også en forutsetning for at det skal foregå god språktilegnelse. Det du leser må være noe som interesserer deg, og som fenger deg, og som gjør at du husker det du har lest. Hvis ikke du husker det du har lest, så skjer det ingenting oppi hodet. Og så er det da til slutt noe jeg har lyst til å si som både har med lesing av bøker å gjøre, men også det å lytte til episodene i spanskpodden. Og det er nemlig noen ord jeg vil si om dette med repetisjon. Grunnen til dette er at ikke mange er klar over at når vi hører på noe eller leser noe mange ganger, skjer det noe i hodet som gjør at vi husker og lærer det vi hører. Ved første gangs gjennomhøring eller gjennomlesning skjer det ikke så mye i den delen av hjernen hvor det foregår langtidslagring. Vi er da opptatt av å få med oss det vi hører eller leser, og forstå det som eller forstå det som blir sagt. Neste gang og gangene etter dette blir informasjonen lagret på en måte som gjør at vi intuitivt husker det vi har hørt. Derfor er det altså viktig at du i denne prosessen ikke bare hører eller leser en gang, men lytter eller leser mange ganger. Da begynner hjernen å prosessere det du hører på en måte som gjør at du går opp spor i hjernen og kan begynne å bruke dette selv som din egen ferdighet. Derfor sier jeg alltid at du skal høre på episoden i spanskpodden mange ganger, fordi da foregår det tilegnelse av språket du har hørt på i episodene i spanskpodden. Og til slutt så vil jeg bare minne om at intervjuet med Adriana Ramirez fra Colombia foregår på engelsk og ikke på spansk. Da håper jeg at du synes dette er interessant, og etter at intervjuet er ferdig, så kommer jeg tilbake med litt mer informasjon om det som egentlig forårsaker alt dette som jeg holder på nå, nemlig at du får et nytt tilbud i plattformen på Habla Online, som heter Vamos a leer. Så etter intervjuet så skal jeg snakke om dette nye tilbudet på plattformen til Habla Online. Lykke til med intervjuet, og så høres vi etter at det er over. So I'm happy today to introduce to you Adriana Ramirez, who is a very experienced teacher teaching Spanish as a foreign language using new methods in her teaching. So Adriana, welcome to my podcast, Spanskpodden, which is the name in Norwegian, which is the podcast about Spanish, really, it means in English. So could you introduce yourself to my public and to my audience and tell us a little bit about you, who you are and your experiences in teaching Spanish as a foreign language?
Okay, yes, thank you for having me here. It is a pleasure for me to be with you in this space. Like you said, my name is Adriana Ramirez. I am originally from Colombia, from Medellin, Colombia, but I live in Vancouver, Canada. I teach Spanish in high school. I am a Spanish teacher, grades 9 to 12, and I've been teaching for 20 years. So this is part of my life. I love teaching. I was a teacher in Colombia. I taught English in Colombia, ELL. And when I moved to Canada, I started teaching Spanish. So my experience is with high school students and also with adults. I also teach Spanish to adults. And I have to add, I'm also a writer. So I teach Spanish, but I also write books, stories in Spanish, written for language learners.
Okay, that's good, because the reading and the books is actually the reason why we are talking, because I find
your books very inspirational, both on a level of content and also when it comes to learning new languages. And I mean, if I had your books when I was learning Spanish when I was a young student, I would have enjoyed very much reading your books. So can you tell me a bit about we talk about, as Spanish teachers, we talk about the difference between learning a language and acquiring a language. Can you tell me and people that listen what is the difference between acquiring and learning a language?
So, in the traditional way of teaching and learning languages, students are usually exposed to a grammar concept and they then practice the concept, rehearse dialogues, are tested about that conjugation, that grammar concept, and then move on. So that is when we learn the language. We learn about the language. We learn the fancy names, the fancy terminology. We practice the grammar, but that's very different from acquiring languages. I always say you learn a language from your brain and you acquire a language from your heart. So what we want to do is acquire the language. It has to come from your heart. So you don't learn any fancy grammar terminology. You don't practice verb conjugations. You simply are immersed in the language at a level that fits you. It has to be a comprehensible input level that is for you. And you learn language in context. So your teacher will tell you stories, will share pictures with you, will engage with you in meaningful discussions, and that will allow you to acquire language. And the most simple way to understand this is think of our babies. Our babies in our lives that's what we do naturally as humans. That's what we do. We talk to the babies, we talk to the little ones at their level, with comprehensible input. We do not teach them grammar. We do not practice conjugations with them. We just engage in a conversation and they magically learn the language. I would say acquire the language. They acquire the language and they start talking naturally. And that's what we want to do in our language classes.
So, why do you then think it's recommendable to read? Why do you use reading? Because I know that you're when you teach Spanish in your classes in Vancouver, I know that you use books, reading, and also since you are a writer, and why do you think it helps to read?
So we acquire languages by providing our brains, our heads with comprehensible input. Comprehensible input, it's a language and input that is understood by us. So there are two ways of giving our brains comprehensible input. There are two ways of feeding our brains language that they can understand. And those ways are listening to our teacher, that would be the listening input that our teacher gives us, but also reading. So those are the two ways that we use to feed our brains with the language that we're learning. So that is why reading is very powerful, because we get the comprehensible input from the teacher, but we also need to get it from reading. And if we get both ways, we're going to learn a lot. So that's why reading at our level. So it doesn't make sense just to go and buy any random author in Spanish, in this case, if they're learning in Spanish, and read, because if it's too hard, you're not acquiring languages. It has to be at your level. Same way, and I'm going to go back to the example of the babies. If I give a baby in Colombia, Don Quixote, which is a very famous Spanish book, the baby speaks Spanish or the toddler speaks Spanish, but they won't be able to read and understand Don Quixote, and nothing from it will appeal to them. So we give them books written for toddlers. We give them books about bears and chickens and pigs, and they have fun and they learn a lot through reading. So it is the same process for us when we're learning a second, third, fourth language. We learn a lot from reading, but the reading has to be geared, produced for different levels of acquisition.
And it's also important that the content of the book that you're reading is interesting to you, so that you can identify with the content in the book. So when, for instance, I'm like from the generation of women that started to fight for women's rights to participate in the society from the 60s and the 70s. So when I found that book that you have written about Maria Cano, I found that very compelling and interesting, because she actually talked about the things that I was thinking about when I was a young student, and so let's talk about a bit about. Perhaps you could tell me a bit about why do you write books?
So I started writing books because I saw the lack of stories that authentically represented my country and my people. And I also saw the lack of stories written by native Spanish speakers. So I saw that void in the market, you could say. And I also saw that a lot of the stories that were written were perpetuating stereotypes. They were problematic in some ways. So I decided to just start writing and telling the world the stories from my country and my people from the inside out. Most of my books, I think all my books are about Colombia, something in Colombia. The purpose of me as a writer is sharing with the world who we are as people, trying to break stereotypes, because outside the world knows us just by a couple things, but we are way more than that. So that's also my job as a writer, to show you all the beautiful faces, the beautiful stories, the beautiful things that we can share with the world. So that's why I write. I also like, when I read a book with my students, I like the feeling of reading something written by a native speaker. Mm-hmm. The authenticity of the phrases, the sayings that we use, all of those things. I saw that was lacking in the literature that I had access to use with my own students. So that's why I started writing.
Yeah, because when I started with this method and wanted to start to read with my students, I only found books that were written by authors from the US. Mm-hmm. They all had names and locations in the books were from the US. And for me, that was kind of silly, because I, as a Norwegian teacher, wanted to have books that were the environment would be Latin American, with people, with students, with young people, grown-ups, with names from Latin America, and so I when I found your books, I just, oh yes, this is good, because these books have been written for people who are reading about Latin America or learning Spanish. They have original names, Spanish names. Everything is located in a Spanish-speaking world. And that, for me, was the essential thing that made me look and find more books by you. So I have actually, for myself, I've been reading, and I also have had people buy your books from Amazon, and we have been using your books in my classes already for a couple of years already. So this new thing that I'm trying to do now is to include reading books as a very strong and powerful way to learn foreign languages, and my experience has been exactly that. But reading books have been a very strong way to actually learn the foreign language.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like us to say a few words about the strategies. How do you use the book? What, take us from the starting point. You have a new book in your hand. What do you do? How do you ask your students to use that material that they have, the treasure that they have between their hands with a new book?
So there are a lot of things that a teacher can do with the book, but I'm going to talk first about the things that a student should do with the book, because
exactly.
a lot of the reading can also and should also happen as a free voluntary reading for the sake of reading for pleasure. The students get their books, read their books, and just sit with a cup of coffee or whatever you drink and enjoy reading. And that's when we learn. When we're reading for pleasure, not for learning, that's when our head starts learning and acquiring the language unconsciously and magically. Now, as a student, the first thing that you have to do is that you have to read the first couple pages and check how much of those pages you understand. And you should be understanding 90% of those pages. Some words are going to be new, of course. That's why all the books have a glossary in the back, and you can go and check the glossary for the translation in context of that word. But you have to be able to understand 85%, I would be going to the low part, up. 85%, 90%, 95%. If it's too hard, if it's 60%, 50%, that's not the right book for you. Please do not read it independently. You might do another kind of reading with your teacher when the teacher guides the reading and does activities to scaffold the comprehension of the chapter. That's different. But when you're reading independently, please read the first couple pages. If it's too hard, if it feels hard, it stops being reading for pleasure, and then we're missing the point here of using reading for learning and language acquisition. So that is one thing. The other thing regarding the reading is that you have to read and reread. So Bill Van Patten, and he's a PhD specialized in linguistics. He's from the US. He has been saying this for a while, and this is backed up by years of research. When you reread, your brain starts picking up the grammar unconsciously. So when we read something the first time, the brain naturally wants to know the storyline. The brain wants to know what is going to happen. We can't help it. We want to know what is going to happen. When we reread, then we know what's going to happen. The brain starts seeing things without an effort. You don't have to make an effort. You just reread and you start picking and saying things. And my father-in-law one time said to me, rereading a book is like talking to an old friend that you haven't talked to this person in years. So you're meeting again with this friend and talking to the friend again. So rereading, if you have the privilege of time and you can give yourself the gift of rereading, go for it. Finish the book. You can put it aside, and then next week you grab it again and you reread it. And a lot of powerful things are going to happen there.
Okay, that's good, because I was thinking that instead of saying read from page so to page so, I would start my session with the new book. I would say you should read the whole book by yourself with a cup of coffee. And then when we start working with the book or discussing or talking about the content of the book, you have already read the whole book, because then your brain will start to process a lot of things when we go back to the book and reread the book in a group in the classroom, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, that's my question to you. Do you think that will be a good way of method that we can?
You can do this. You can do that. You can ask them to read not the whole book, but one chapter. Bring this chapter read for my class, and then you do your things, your activities in class. And by doing activities, you might go over parts of the book, or you are reading a chapter for the first time with them in class. They have not read it. You're reading it with them, and then homework might be, okay, you are going to go home and reread the chapter. However you choose as a teacher to do it, giving the opportunity and the time to reread each chapter.
Yeah. So, did you have or can we talk a bit about the method TPRS to see how this method is integrated as a method in your book when you write the book? Do you have that method in mind when you write the book?
So what I'm going to move away from TPRS first to give more context. So comprehensible input methodologies. Comprehensible input methodologies is like an umbrella. And I'm saying methodologies because there are a lot of ways that we can use to provide comprehensible input to our students. There is not just one way. There are a lot of ways to provide them with comprehensible input. So it's like an umbrella, comprehensible input methodologies. There are different ways of doing it. One of the ways is TPRS, which is teaching with the stories, one of the ways. Another way is reading. So when I write my books, besides, I have so many things in mind. I want to share my culture, my people. I want to share my stories. But I also, when I write at different levels. So I have books for beginners, which are my Mosca books. They are for like pure beginners, and adults read them and they have a lot of fun reading them because I'm using sayings that are very popular in Spanish with the word Mosca. And I have books for level 2, level 3, level 4. We usually in North America use 1, 2, 3, 4. Level 1 and 2 would be in the European context A1, A2, and level 3 and 4 would be B1 and B2.
Okay.
Basically.
Yeah.
So what I have in mind as a writer is I choose the story that I have to share with the world, and then I choose what level am I going to write this story for. And because I teach all the levels, I teach beginners to IB, advanced to students, I sit in my mind when I'm writing with the level here, thinking of the students that I am writing for, the level, and then I write at that level. So that's why the books are written under the comprehensible input umbrella, because they are geared for language learners. The stories are interesting. They are compelling. They're very authentic. They're very cultural. You're learning Spanish, but at the same time, you're learning a lot about another culture. And the input is abundant. You're reading a lot of Spanish is coming to your head. So you're doing a favor for your head. I mean, the Spanish part, you're learning Spanish, but you're also getting into this culture. I'm opening this window and you can peek through the window and learn about this culture, these people, the phrases that they use, the sayings that they use, the way of understanding and seeing the world. So you're learning so many things by reading any of these books or my books.
Yes, and that is, the thing about reading, and so.
I wanna complement something, and you also, when you're reading, you're also, there is something in the CI world, comprehensible input world, that we call shelter subject matter. Shelter subject matter. So when you are reading a book, for example, you read El Camino del Café.
Mm-hmm.
When you finish the book, you know a lot about coffee in Spanish. So
Yeah.
shelter subject matter is that we have a topic, but it's
Yep.
sheltered through the story. So when you finish the book and if they read it with the teacher, like you, and then you do all your things and everything, they finish the book and they actually know a lot about coffee in Spanish. The one Maria Cano has a lot of feminism, workers' labor rights, all of that. So you finish the book and you have all that vocab to talk about that topic in Spanish.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So yeah. So and then so this comprehensible input, I want to because that is actually the whole point of how to learn a foreign language. You learn a foreign language by listening and reading a lot of language that you understand.
Mm-hmm.
So comprehensible input is kind of language that in a foreign language that you understand. So the comprehension is so essential for any language learning situation, actually. And as I also have said many times, that if you don't understand the language that you are listening to, it's all going to be gibberish. You will never learn anything. But if you learn the language, so reading and repeating everything many times, that is the essence of all kind of language learning.
In context, like in the story, everything attached to a story that gives you context. Yes,
exactly.
I agree.
Exactly. So so the TPRS is one way of using comprehensible input.
Exactly.
And so did you have TPRS in your mind when you write your books?
I had comprehensible input in my mind.
Yes, exactly. So TPRS is just one way of using comprehensible input as a teaching method in your classes. Mm-hmm. So let's then stick to the point of comprehensible input. We don't have to talk about TPRS, actually. Mm-hmm. And do you yourself use your own books when you are teaching Spanish in Canada?
Yes, I use my own books. I use other people's books as well. I try to have as many books as I can. I have a decent classroom library. And when they give me money to buy more books, I buy more books. But I use my books. I really like my books because I find them, like I said before, I find them very authentic. The language, they are very cultural, and we can do a lot of things around the culture that each book brings. All my books are also written from a social justice perspective. All of them have a social justice component that you can also, as a teacher, pull the thread and do a whole thing around that. Like El Camino del Café talks about la Federación Nacional de Cafeteros de Colombia, and that is Comercio Justo, fair trade. Maria Cano, that you're reading it talks about imperialism, it talks about feminism, it talks about a lot of things that are social justice related. Es posible soñar talks about turismo responsable, responsible tourism. It talks also about graffitis as a way of expressing political ideas or discomfort, art.
Yeah. And es posible soñar. ¿Qué nivel? What level of Spanish does that book have?
Es posible soñar would be level 4.
Okay, so it's a bit complex, but because I have to choose between books that are not too difficult, because it depends on the level of my Spanish level of my students. But so I actually have started. I'm going to use Maria Cano, and the other one I'm thinking about is.
So you have Me Perdí en Medellín. Me Perdí en Medellín
Perdido en
easy.
Medellín.
Yes.
So those two books are the first two books that I'm going to start in my reading class.
And around the same level is also El Entierro.
Sí.
El Entierro is around the same level.
Yes.
And then a little bit harder is ¿Qué dijiste?
Okay.
¿Qué dijiste is about someone, I co-author that one with another person. It's about someone that has difficulties hearing.
Okay.
It's a very beautiful story. It's based on real life events, and it makes us the social justice point in this story is that it makes us be aware of our privileges. Sometimes, so many times, we take everything for granted, and we don't realize how privileged we are. So the story is inspired in a person that can't hear well. So this person, even though they have hearing aids, they are used to reading the lips.
Okay.
We get to the pandemic and everyone has masks. So now you are incommunicated with the world because you cannot understand what the other person is telling you.
Okay.
So the story is inspired in that. So it makes you question your privileges and what do we do as a society to make our world more inclusive. Un nuevo amanecer.
Yeah.
So, ¿qué dijiste? Is a little bit harder than Maria Cano.
Okay.
And then going to level 4 when your students are more advanced, then we have Es posible soñar. We have Un nuevo amanecer is inspired in La leyenda del Dorado. That is a very famous Colombian story that we grew up with based on real events. El Camino del Café, Rigo, El Cóndor de los Andes, and the last one that when they read that, they can feel like we know Spanish, is La Marimba de mi abuelo.
Ah.
That one, it would be at the end of level 4 and is based on my grandpa's life.
Okay.
So that one is really good, but they need to have a lot of books. They need to read a lot of books before they get to that one.
Yeah. So this is actually very good that we have talked about the different books that you have. So I can use that as well as my books of preference in my books.
So let us round up this conversation about this interesting topic. And I want to thank you so much for taking time to talk to me today. This has been a great talk about how to use books as comprehensible input. So thank you so much and bye-bye. I denne episoden har du hørt et intervju med Adriana Ramirez, som har skrevet bøker som man kan bruke i prosessen med å lære spansk. Grunnen til at jeg har gjort dette er at jeg planlegger oppstart av en lesegruppe i Spanskportalen fra tirsdag 1. november. Lesegruppen vil ta for seg bøker som blant annet er skrevet av Adriana og andre forfattere som skriver bøker som kan brukes som Comprehensible input, forståelig språkinnhold. Dette tilbudet er det eneste her i Norge som gir deg muligheten til å finne comprehensible input og lese bøker på spansk som du forstår, og kan diskutere språk og innhold sammen med andre som har lest de samme bøkene. Du finner boklisten på Habla Online Spanskportalen under fanen som heter Vamos a leer. Siden dette en nylansering, vil du få tilbud om medlemskap til redusert pris. I beskrivelsen av denne podcast-episoden finner du linker hvor du kan melde deg inn og registrere deg for medlemskap på Vamos a leer bare. Det betyr at du bare har tilgang til lesegruppen og ikke resten av innholdet på portalen. Hvis du allerede medlem av portalen, så vil du få tilgang uten tillegg i prisen til å være med i lesegruppen Vamos a leer. Så da håper jeg at jeg ser deg eller hører deg inne i portalen før 1. november, sånn at vi kan starte med å lese de bøkene vi skal lese for å bli kjempegode i spansk.